So I want to begin, thank you for that introduction. I actually applied to give a brown bag lecture because I got an email about it and totally did not expect to be accepted. Not one bit. And when I got the email saying I was, it was a complete shock. So I not only appreciate the opportunity to do this, but I also appreciate the work that the Humanities Center does for the university and the very active presence it has on campus. So, but I want to begin because it would be incredibly irresponsible if I didn't start by giving due thanks to those people who, whether in large ways and small, have contributed to the position that I find myself in today. So my identity as a teacher has been shaped and molded by those teachers who have taken an active role in mentoring me. And first and foremost, we have one faculty member here today. I want to thank the Rhetoric and Composition faculty in the Department of English. In particular, Richard Marbach, who you see sitting right there, Francis Ranny and Jeff Prushnick. And I'm grateful, and I'm constantly needing to remind myself that it really is a privilege to work with all three of those faculty members on a daily basis. So I want to start by thanking them. Second, unfortunately you couldn't be here today. I want to thank Professor Ariel Helfer, who is actually a brand new political theory professor, who among other things has introduced me to the work of the political theorist Leo Strauss and has contributed greatly to the ways in which I approach matters pertaining to political theory and political philosophy. And third, I want to thank Barbara Jones from the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, who herself is a mentor of Grace Lee, or a mentee of Grace Lee Boggs. And through my work with her, I consider myself kind of a second generation mentee of Grace, who has done more to probably shape my views on education and citizenship than most others. And then secondly, what I'd like to do is give you some background on where I position myself academically. My academic identity is principally informed by two broad areas of thought: political theory and rhetoric and composition studies. I have a particular interest in democratic theory, as well as anti-Enlightenment political thought. So at present, and here's my high school government teacher who has made it all the way here and Mrs. Berniglio, I appreciate you
high school student government advisor.
So I have a particular interest in anti-Enlightenment political thought as well as democratic theory. At present, I am working on a paper on Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, and I have further plans to study Rousseau, Hobbes, and Edmund Burke. And my interest in rhetoric and composition studies is primarily pedagogical. In short, I'm interested in the means by which writing instruction molds and shapes citizens. To put it a different way, I'm guided by kind of the rhetorical dimensions of citizenship and the means by which we as teachers take part in cultivating a democratic character in our students. In this, I borrow heavily from the work of James Berlin, who is responsible for kind of diffusing a social epistemic theory of rhetoric and writing. But anyways, enough with that. Our agenda today will be remarkably simple, and what I would like to do is give enough time at the end. I know I try to be sensitive to time. I've been in many lectures where they have gone over remarkably, and I want to give enough time for discussion at the end. So I'm going to start with, and actually the original impetus for this research project was an event that occurred at Middlebury College in March of this year. In March of this year, Charles Murray was invited by the American Enterprise Club, which is a student organization at Middlebury College in Vermont. He was not given a college official invitation, but rather he was invited by a group of students who wanted to hear him come speak about a new book he wrote called Coming Apart. But it is important to note that he is a man of deeply problematic ideas. Most infamously, probably, I think it was 30 years ago, wrote a book called The Bell Curve, which included a controversial chapter on IQ scores and race. In their campus announcement detailing Murray's visit, the student organization that invited him encouraged students to come and debate with Murray. And they also invited a left-leaning faculty member, Allison Stanger, to engage in a public discussion with Murray following his lecture. So a means by which to hold him accountable for what he was saying to the students. Now that the student organization actively encouraged students to hold him accountable for his views in a discussion, and that they invited a faculty member to engage with him is especially important for understanding how disappointing the ensuing events were. Because this was supposed to be a dialogue in which Murray's views were to be challenged and responded to by students and faculty. Now, Murray was not even permitted to begin his lecture because he was interrupted by people in the audience shouting over him, hurling names, and seeking to remove him from the event venue. The New York Times reported, quote, But when Mr. Murray rose to speak, he was shouted down by most of the 400 students packed into the room, several witnesses said. Many turned their backs to him and chanted slogans like racist, sexist, anti-gay, Charles Murray, go away. Now, after more than 20 minutes of this, university officials escorted Professor Stanger and Charles Murray to a separate locked room where he was permitted to deliver his talk in conversation with Professor Stanger, but while protesters were gathered in the hallway shouting and pulling fire alarms. Now, after completing the discussion, university officials and Professor Stanger escorted, or attempted to escort Professor Murray to a car where they were going to leave. But in the midst of doing so, they were met with masked protesters who began pushing and shoving both Murray and Stanger. In the process, Professor Stanger suffered a twisted neck because her hair was grabbed by one of the protesters and it was pulled. And as the car carrying Professor Stanger and Murray pulled out of campus, protesters were putting traffic signs in front of the car, jumping on the car and shaking it. Now, these are just a couple of pictures from the event. That's Charles Murray at the lectern. So, these types of passionate disagreements, as I'm going to argue today, are naturally embedded in the very fabric of democratic societies. Now, when thinking about this, Madison's famous metaphor in the Federalist Papers comes to mind here. Democracy, or disagreement and faction, right, are to democracy what air is to fire. Without one, the other cannot exist. There was, however, something different about what happened at Middlebury, though. The kind of anger and violence all seem to point me to the direction of asking why. Why is it that when met with a controversial idea from a controversial speaker, the response should be to engage in attempts to silence and intimidate speakers into submission and complicity? Now, I no doubt want to defend what Murray was going to say, because I believe he is a problematic speaker, but I'm seeking to understand why the response to him was one of hostility and, in this case, violence. Now, if, as I believe, that colleges and universities have a political responsibility to mold citizens, why should the presumption be to encourage behavior that is both damaging and corrosive to the ebb and flow of public discourse? And further, is it not here, such as at this university, that students should be taught how to deal with ideas they find uncomfortable, challenging, and controversial? Now, my preliminary answer to these questions is yes. And my endeavor in this research project, as much as possible, is to discuss how this can be possible. Now, as a theorist, I wish to caution you against anything prescriptive you may draw from my remarks today. I will not be proposing any specific solution, rather, but discussing one aspect of this larger discussion that I find valuable. And further, it is my hope that matters of praxis as they relate to the classroom, we do have a few teachers here today, and my colleagues, fellow graduate teaching assistants here, as they relate to the classroom can be discovered in the discussion that I hope to have after. Now, more to the point though, my work here is a response to a general atmosphere of hostility and controversy that has become more common on college campuses as of late. And in light of this, I wish if you can kind of keep what I just described at Middlebury in the back of your head as I go through my remarks, I think that might be helpful. So, in 1872, at the age of just 27, Frederick Nietzsche was invited to give a series of lectures at the University of Basel where he was teaching classics. In his first lecture, upon the announcement of his choice of topic, he described it as, quote, in a certain sense so unnerving that I, like you, would listen to anyone who promised to teach me something about it, no matter how young he was. That topic was education. And it eventually turned into a series of 6 lectures called Anti-Education, which you can buy, and I highly suggest you do so. So this, of course, is nothing new, though. In the tradition of Western philosophy dating all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, has been one of a kind of compulsive preoccupation with education, and specifically education as it relates to civic and political life in democratic societies. The ancients viewed education to be central to the endeavor of creating a literate and engaged public. One is immediately reminded here of the quite lengthy discussion afforded to education in the Republic between Socrates and Glaucon. The perfect city, it is argued, cannot exist without a proper system of education. In Aristotle, we also find this profound attention of education to citizens, stating, quote, citizens should be educated to suit the constitution of their state. And further, Montesquieu echoed this by saying, quote, the laws of education must be relative to the principles of government. In these selected quotes, I have sought to illustrate what I believe to be 2 crucial points. First, that education as it relates to politics and civics exists as a means of preparation for citizenship. a method by which students are equipped with the tools necessary for the demands and the responsibilities of citizenship. In other words, colleges and universities have a political responsibility to students to adequately prepare them to be capable actors in civic life. In asserting this, I wish to deliberately push back against this nonsensical notion that all of my students and other students at universities here are simply here for job training, an idea I will later describe as neoliberalism. And second, education in society is not a private good, but rather a collective one that has far-reaching and long-lasting impacts that no one can escape, no matter how hard you may try. In large and small ways, everyone is impacted by decisions made as they relate to education. Now, consider the work done in the fields of democratic theory. Here I begin with John Dewey, who himself was not a political scientist, he was a philosopher, but wrote extensively on both democracy and education. For Dewey, education was not only a means of sustaining society, but also one of sustaining and cultivating a self. The latter he viewed as integral to the society at large. These two for him connected, because education was the means by which someone can obtain what he calls his completest development. Again, this reference to self. Educational institutions were thus charged with enabling students to attend to this task, to work to develop their capacities in such a way as to enable them to locate and find the point at which they act with what he calls an individual initiation. In doing so, they will, according to Dewey, find, quote, the full significance of personality which can be learned by the individual only as it is already presented to him in objective form in society. Here, the full significance of personality can refer to what we describe as agency and acts of citizenship. Society, Dewey argues, is best served by a citizenry that is of the completest development. This is, for me, an illustration of my first point presented about education, of its responsibility to students. Secondly, Dewey also speaks to the societal implications of education. In both the school and society and the child and curriculum, Dewey writes that, quote, whenever we have in mind the discussion of a new movement in education, it is especially necessary to take the broader or societal view. Taken this way, education is one of a collective or societal value, one that exists apart from any one individual, but rather as an object of collective and social utility. This illustrates my second point about the broader responsibilities of educational institutions and their responsibilities to not just students, but the society at large. Take now contemporary work done in the fields of democratic theory, all of which no doubt owe an immense debt of gratitude to both the ancients and John Dewey, among many, many others. In her book, Democratic Education, the political scientist Amy Gutmann writes that educational institutions have a responsibility to cultivate what she calls a democratic character in students. Indeed, she goes so far as to say that concerns about education, quote, lie at the core of our commitment to democracy. It is Gutmann's opinion that a democratic theory of education, quote, supplies the foundations upon which a democratic society can secure the civil and political freedoms of its adult citizens without placing their welfare or its very survival at great risk. And what about this democratic education? What does Gutmann envision as the saving grace of such a conception of democratic education? She considers primarily deliberation and discourse to be at the core of her concept of education. It is worth mentioning here, though, that much of her research is actually credited with diffusing what we call deliberative democratic theory, which focuses on public discourse and engagement verbally between citizens about mutually binding issues. In this, she does not seek to gloss over disagreement, but rather, in her words, make a democratic value out of them. The lifeblood of democratic life in this is the freedom to disagree and engage in an ideological clash of ideas. And so it follows then that a democratic conception of education is aimed at preparing citizens for life in a democracy would be so focused as to equip students with the knowledge and tools they need to have agency in civic and political life. The ideal citizen for Gutmann, it seems, is one that has the ability to deliberate and engage in political discourse in a thoughtful, rational, and substantive manner. Quote, the willingness to deliberate about mutually binding matters distinguishes a democratic citizen from self-interested citizens who argue merely to advance their own interests. Deliberation, then, is not a single virtue, but rather a task that demands the execution of a whole set of skills, namely, literacy, critical thinking, and tolerance of dissenting and disagreeing opinions. A curriculum designed to educate students would thus be designed to teach these skills, to engage students on a level that enables them to be thoughtful and critical thinkers who are capable of engaging in discourse, reasonably disagreeing, and respecting those who do disagree. There is a willingness and an impetus to respect here that I believe to be massively missing both from what happened at Middlebury and in our political discourse as a whole. The idea of politely and respectfully disagreeing and the willingness to seek out differing opinions seem to be replaced by the general trend towards meanness, divisiveness, and in some cases, violence. Now, I find this to be unnerving, to paraphrase Nietzsche's adjective again, for a number of reasons. First, because of the primacy placed on deliberation and discourse in democratic societies. Along with Gutmann, other schools of thought, including people like Habermas, Rawls, and Chantal Mouffe, place ideological and discursive conflicts at the heart of democratic life. Indeed, as Gutmann and Thompson note, political life should be focused around, quote, public reasoned discussion and debate. My interest in rhetoric and composition studies is primarily focused around this idea, an approach to democracy and citizenship that emphasizes the rhetorical and discursive dimensions of such an idea. This is no doubt what both Koch and Villadsen refer to as the enactment of citizenship as discursively constituted. Quote, citizens enact their citizenship rhetorically when they interact as citizens in language and or other symbolic systems. For example, when they present, hear, or read opinions and arguments to find their own position on an issue of shared concern. Now, my second preoccupation is with educational institutions as they relate to this goal of civic and political education. What I have sought to do so far is twofold. First, to identify the importance of education in the broader structure of democratic societies, both as they relate to the responsibilities to students and the society at large. Second, I have attempted to emphasize the discursivity of democracy and democratic education. This emphasis is no accident. It is rather a response to the event at Middlebury College and what I view as its illustration of something missing in the civic and political life of both our students and our society at large. This paper will attempt to construct or posit a theory of education that seeks to remedy what I believe to be a problem in our public discourse, namely the perversion to certain ideas that are almost certainly controversial. In short, what I find to have occurred at Middlebury is a deficit in the reasoned and rational discourse that should, in theory, form the basis for political life in America and the education that students receive, so as to equip them to engage in rational and reasoned debate that is so vitally needed in democratic societies. Now, over the course of the past few decades, a gradual shift in educational priorities has resulted in the decreased collective and societal power of education. In the post-World War II decade, right up until about the 1980s, you can kind of use Ronald Reagan as a benchmark for all sorts of things, including this. The consensus was that education had, quote, the potential to elevate the life chances and opportunities of those born into poverty and disadvantage. In creating the first national public education system, Horace Mann said, quote, education then, beyond all other divides of human origin, is a great equalizer of conditions of men, the balance wheel of the social machinery. Education traditionally then has been a tool used to engender societal equality and upward mobility, although nothing quite touches Mann's description or descriptive prose in the use of the phrase great equalizer. Historically, if conceptions of education could be defined by what they value, namely upward mobility, equality, and responsible and engaged citizenship, then education as of late can be described using the rise of private interests that trump social needs, to quote Henry Giroux, thus invariably creating a situation in which economic growth becomes more important than social justice. Colleges and universities no longer have a responsibility to society or to students, but rather to the market, and the production of education is no longer, or the product of education is no longer a competent citizen, but rather an employee. My own mentor, Grace Lee Boggs, described this as the obsolete factory theory of education that, quote, sorts, tracks, tests, and rejects or certifies working class children as if they were products on an assembly line. She goes on to say that this obsolete factory model of education essentially treats students as disposable, identifiable solely by their ability to, quote, fit into the economic machine as workers and consumers. Now, the immediate effect of such a theory of education is twofold. First, the civic and political impetus is drained from education, shifting the priority from education for citizenship to education as job training. And second is the rise of what I am describing as a theory known as Neoliberal Universality. So the term Neoliberal Universality is twofold. First, it involves the term neoliberal, which is oftentimes referred to as just neoliberal. At the outset, I wish to say that I distance myself from the often irresponsible and brazen ways in which the term neoliberal is used. And as someone engaged in the enterprise of political theory, I wish to be as responsible with my usage of these types of political and economic ideas as possible. Having said this, though, I do not wish to minimize the significance of the idea of neoliberalism. Now, neoliberalism is both political and economic. In fact, one could say that the economic part drives the political aspect of neoliberalism. Of those studying neoliberalism, David Harvey is perhaps in a league of his own, and his definition is as follows. Neoliberalism is a theory of political and economic practices proposing that human well-being can best be advanced by the maximization of entrepreneurial freedoms within an institutional framework characterized by private property rights, individual liberty, unencumbered markets, and free trade. In a neoliberal society, I am again paraphrasing Harvey here, the role of the state is not to advance societal good, but to maximize profit and economic growth, or what Harvey describes as the quality and integrity of money. The political practices here mentioned are those that are engaged for the sole task of protecting private property. To consider two examples, economic practices of neoliberalism would include economic policies that funnel wealth upward, the lowering of taxes on the richest in society, for example, or the pursuit of so-called free trade deals. The political practices would be the dismantling of the safety net, including public education, and the false belief that it is indeed the possibility for everyone to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. This is, among other things, as noted by Giroux, a form of social Darwinism, in which the means of basic human survival are left up to individuals themselves, who learn to expect nothing from the larger society or from the government. To quote Giroux, this is described in his very vivid prose as, quote, a theater of cruelty. And so, in short, to offer another perspective on neoliberalism, it is a set of political and economic practices built on the belief that, quote, free markets without government interference would be the most efficient and socially optimal allocation of resources. My use of the term universality, though, is where I attempt to describe the pervasive influence of neoliberalism in colleges and universities. In colleges and universities, neoliberalism manifests itself in two main ways. The first, which I've somewhat touched on, is the rise of corporate and business interests in decisions made about higher education policy. It is becoming increasingly obvious that colleges and universities are trapped in an environment where the most valued opinion about higher education are from those people who have money and donate lots of it to the university. Where once stood a fidelity and responsibility to students, now stands an obligation to systematize and routinize the work of teaching, to fit some number-crunching scheme designed to encourage a 4-year graduation rate, boost enrollment and retainment numbers, and increase the economic power of a university. This also is manifested in the ways in how students are treated. A major contribution of Henry Giroux, for example, to the field of pedagogy has been his insistence on how students are essentially treated as disposable in the grand scheme of things. And this is the impetus for my use of the term neoliberal universality. Now, the literature on this is sparse, and some of it refers to what is called neoliberal sameness, but it is my opinion that these do not come close to touching the actual heart of how neoliberalism affects students. In a neoliberal university, students are virtually the same. The identity of a student is universal. For administrators especially, the individual identity of students is of little importance. What matters instead is the economic potential of students to enter the workforce following graduation. In this model, there are two things of importance, each of them building off of the other. University courses become reflective of economic and corporate interests. Here I am referring to not only shorter class periods, which I'm sure many of us here can relate to, increased student numbers in classrooms, more adjunct faculty members, and the standardization of course content. This is what some in the field have described as the streamlining of education, so as to model an assembly line of a factory. Think also about the courses and departments that most thrive in the business atmosphere of a neoliberal university. Traditionally, as noted by James Berlin, a liberal arts education was once characterized by its commitment to, among other things, rhetoric, the ability to articulate one's own position on matters both apolitical and political. The departments once entrusted with administering that education, history, rhetoric and composition, political science, and philosophy, and I'm sure there are others, have been eclipsed by those that offer courses designed to increase the likelihood of employment. Students are not encouraged to pursue majors they are passionate about, but rather those that will land them a job. The departments most hurt by this are those who once stood at the forefront of a liberal arts education. Now there is, I believe, a reason for this. Civic and political education fosters difference and diversity on campus. A neoliberal university cannot exist if its most valuable asset is in a position to think critically. The design of a college education thus takes on a market value, one that doesn't entrust or instruct students to think critically to engage, but rather one that promises them a job. And the departments and courses once entrusted with ensuring the promise of a civic education fall prey to those who promise employment and economic success. In this scheme, my use of the term universality refers to this reduction of students to their purchasing power. It refers to the active discouragement of difference and diversity of opinion on college campuses. And it refers to the increasingly corporate character of an education that places sole value on the means by which economic success and meritocracy can be sustained and empowered through educational practices. Students are indeed universal in this sense that each of us fills a need. Each of us fills a job slot. And apart from this, nothing else is of very much importance. Our differences do not matter, and I would venture to say that in most cases such differences would be discouraged because they disrupt the flow of things. Grace Lee Boggs' term factory model education is of, I believe, adequate use here. It captures what I am trying to say: diversity of opinion, difference, and debate and discussion and their resulting effects. A critically informed and literate citizen disrupt the uniformity and linearity of neoliberalism, which thrives on standardization and efficiency. Yes, democracy is messy. But this messiness and the means by which it functions pose a threat to neoliberalism and its promise of economic success. Thus, my term neoliberal universality is one that stresses the economic and political aspects of neoliberalism as they relate to higher education, but also, more importantly, the means by which these policies reduce students to their purchasing power as consumers. Now, one of the truly great democratic theorists of our time is a woman named Chantal Mouffe, who, among other things, is famous for her work with Ernesto Laclau. They wrote a very influential book called Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, maybe 30 years ago or 40 years ago. Now, one of the key concepts that guide her work is her insistence on the conflicts and disagreements that are naturally embedded in democratic societies. She stresses what she describes as the agonism inherent in democracies. She states that, quote, "My claim is that it is possible to understand democratic politics, or it is impossible to understand democratic politics without acknowledging passions as the driving force in the political field." For Mouffe, the very foundation of what is properly considered, quote, the political, is conflict, passions, vices, and discord. It is impossible to eclipse this, and here her main critique of liberal theory is that it focuses on what she calls rationalism. It preaches a rationalism that does not speak to conflict or passions, just reason alone. And so both politics and democracies are hotbeds of disagreement, fueled by the virtues and vices and passions of any one person. And the task then of democratic theorists is to understand how best to channel these differences into productive, I emphasize here, productive democratic means. My main argument here is that the pervasiveness of neoliberalism in higher education has sought to preclude and transcend difference and conflict. The principal means by which this has been attempted and accomplished in some cases is the dilution of the civic and political responsibilities of the university by promising economic success and encouraging students to pursue fields of study conducive to these promises. I would even venture to say also that universities have sought to ignore the political altogether. For Mouffe, ignoring the politics or seeking to transcend difference and disagreement is disastrous, if for no other reason than it empties the political of its power and influence. There is, however, another disastrous effect of this decision. It is, to paraphrase her, a game of deferring difference and conflict until it blows up on a larger scale. She attributes the rise of white nationalism and xenophobia to this. She writes, quote, "Until recently, it was through right-wing populist parties that people were able to vent their anger." The theory here is that you ignore conflict, you ignore disagreement, you ignore the kind of clashes that are inherent in democracy. The way that those disagreements are expressed are deferred until it is expressed on a much larger and a much more damaging scale. This is precisely why she attributes xenophobia, white nationalism, and these types of things, to this kind of ignoring of what she calls the political. And so the denial or attempt to avoid conflict is disastrous because it allows resentment and anger to foment in people denied the right to speak and share their opinion. In her work on the political, she describes this as the, quote, consensus of the center. Now, in this, I see an important role for teachers in educational institutions. Teachers must assume the role of what Henry Giroux calls transformative intellectuals. In doing so, they must endeavor to channel the virtues, passions, opinions, and differences of students into productive democratic means that go beyond shouting and ignoring differing political opinions. An adequate means of doing this seems to be the introduction of controversy in the classroom as a touchstone for discussion and deliberation. In this assertion, two texts become highly valuable. The first by Gerald Graff, who writes that teaching conflict and introducing controversial issues in the classroom is a means of, quote, exposing students to an endless series of differing positions so as to overcome the, quote, shouting match that is far too common in intellectual and academic circles. His analysis, in other words, seeks to shed light on how teaching controversial issues and hosting controversial speakers, for example, to return to what I spoke to at the beginning, on campus can avoid becoming, quote, more angry and polarized in the current atmosphere of contention. Controversial issues and speakers can be touchstones for discussion and deliberation for students. This is of particular importance because it illustrates a means by which students can learn to grapple with controversial and differing ideas. I do not wish to induce controversy into college classrooms and university spaces simply because. I believe it to be right because it has the potential to substantively and meaningfully teach students how to engage with controversial ideas. In her book, Controversy in the Classroom, Diana Hess says controversy presents an opportunity for educators to foster the maintenance of democracy and its positive transformation. My focus on the events at Middlebury were to illustrate an example of what I find to be a regressive transformation of democracy, one in which deliberation descends into chaos and, in this case, violence, and the utter refusal to engage on any level. Democracies demand respect and pluralism. They demand a thoughtful exchange of arguments and ideas. Instructing students to engage in this type of behavior, to be thoughtful citizens, must start in colleges and universities. Historically, it is here that such civic and political education has always resided. But the current atmosphere of neoliberalism and economic interests have sterilized university spaces from any attempt at educating students in terms of civic and political matters. By using controversy in the classroom, educators can begin to reclaim a bit of this ground. And in doing so, they can teach students to take the far more intellectual, rigorous, and meaningful route. They can teach students to truly grapple with words and arguments, with the essence of language, rather than covering their ears and shouting it down. This emphasis on disagreement, or the encouragement of students to disagree and seek out argument and debate for its own sake, in using controversial issues in the classroom or inviting controversial speakers to campus, is what I would like to call an agonistic concept of education that does not seek to gloss over conflict, that does not seek to gloss over disagreement or sterilize university spaces from all things political. Such a concept seeks to build on Mouffe's original formulation and transform university spaces into what she calls spaces of, quote, democratic contestations. Spaces in which democracy is practiced through discussion, through argument, through debate, through engaging with those ideas that are sometimes viewed as controversial, and which cause someone to, yes, be angry and yes, be outraged, but nonetheless, in doing so, can channel that anger and outrage into a thoughtful, substantive, and productive manner. So, just a couple of conclusions. I want to start my conclusion by thanking each of you for coming today, and then a couple of remarks to sum up what I've attempted to say. So, historically speaking, higher education was not only a means of upward mobility, but also one of civic and political preparation. Neoliberalism exists to stifle and discourage the civic and political preparation and the differences that result from it, differences that were at one time sought after on college campuses. This is a reflection of the pervasive influence of corporate and business interests in the general atmosphere of higher education. In this, I wish to assign no blame to any one educational institution, but rather illustrate the general atmosphere that colleges and universities are trapped in. Neoliberal universality refers to the disposability assigned to students at universities, in which students are identified solely by their purchasing power. This exists to maintain the stability required for market education to function. In doing so, the civic and political aspect of universities has been virtually eliminated. And in the wake of this, so to also the requisite civic and political training that was once integral to colleges and universities. In short, the political, to use Mouffe's term, has been glossed over. Now, my remedy for such a situation is the use of controversy in the classroom to induce discussion and deliberation among students. In doing so, the goal must be to positively advance the state of political discourse in our society. Much has been made recently about the sensitivities of millennials. I am here referring to the nauseating use of the term snowflake. Now, I find such language to be insulting and insensitive to my generation and the whole that most people of my age find themselves in. In no way do I wish to demean the very admirable sense of moral and political outrage so prevalent among people my age. Instead, I wish to channel that moral outrage into something genuinely real, something that positively contributes to our discourse and goes beyond just shouting. This, for me, is the essence of what Mouffe is trying to say in her formulation around the term agonism. And finally, if I could use one anecdote to describe my conception of higher education as a conclusion, it would be this. Thomas Jefferson famously remarked that the New England Town Hall was the, quote, greatest school for democracy that the world had ever seen. My faith in education and democracy is no different. It is a faith in the ability of citizens to engage in any number of discussions on any number of issues. My own practices as a teacher are deeply rooted in this notion of the truly democratic power of discussion. My students may not be interested in talking, and the ones that are here know that I encourage them to talk. They may not be interested in talking, but my job as a teacher is to encourage them to find their voice and use it to meaningfully counter the speech that they find jarring, disturbing, hateful, and offensive. Not to shout dissenting voices down, but to refute them. The solution to such repugnant speech must be more, better, and more thoughtful speech. This, to me, is the essence of education and democracy. And while we do indeed live in perilous and discouraging times, I find the antidote to the dark times we live in and the promise of a way out of these times to lie in what I hope I share with other people is an unshakable faith in the power of education to create citizens, and in turn the myriad means by which such citizens transform and positively alter the trajectory of our democracy. There is an urgency to be had here. The task at hand is great, and the road ahead is long, and Donald Trump is still president. But I am confident, you guys are supposed to laugh at that. But I am confident that we can meet the task of educating students and in turn, creating citizens who possess the agency, motivation, and inspiration to be thoughtfully committed to the task of preserving and creating a more perfect union. Thank you.
As promised, he has left a lot of time for questions and responses. So,
I would say the thing that stuck with me at the beginning, you said that we see college as job training, which is what I thought it was. Because I'm a first generation college student, I kind of thought it was job training until I graduated, and the day after, everything was exactly the same.
Right.
And you realize it's not a golden ticket, it's more like a contract. So now that I'm a grad student, you realize that you need even more credentials and even more expertise. I don't know, as a first generation college student, I don't see the advantage of it yet, because my brother, he works at Wolverine Packing Plant, he getting paid $25 an hour versus me getting paid, let's say, $11 an hour.
Yeah.
But in the long run, I can see where it's gonna pay off when I get older and whatnot. But do you think that the more education that you have is, I don't know, valuable? As, like, in society today, you know, back in the day, you needed education to get up the corporate ladder. But now it's more like the trades are getting more money.
When my grandma recently passed away, and we've been going over old family stuff. And
Sorry to hear that.
Huh?
Sorry to hear about that.
But one of the things we found was my grandfather's original job offer from General Motors when he first immigrated here from Italy in 1953. Not speaking any English,
Yeah.
not speaking, or not possessing, he didn't even graduate high school. And so, but he was able to get a job, and he was able to raise a family and have a house and have a good life, and now he's retired and he's living off of his pension. But he didn't need an education for any of that. And so I think the answer to your question is twofold. The first is that I think it's like you apply for a job, an entry-level job, and it's like credentials, right? Like bachelor's degree or something like that, right? We keep increasing the number of qualifications that people have to have so as to encourage them to go to get an education. So I don't know if it's necessarily more valuable, but I think the increased importance placed on education is good. But I think there seems to be, and one of the things that Bernie Sanders talks about a lot is the need to not only education, but encourage students to go get trade jobs, right? Go to trade school. We need construction workers, we need plumbers, we need electricians, we need locksmiths, right? We still need these people. And so while an education is increasingly more valuable and it's required for a lot of things, I think we also have to take a step back and know that, there are still jobs that we need that don't necessarily require that people go to college or anything. But I think it is kind of a business thing, right? It's like you get accepted and then you go to college, and it's like keep going to college and keep going. I kept going to college, but right? But yeah, so that's, I think, did that answer your question? Is that?
Yes. For me, I mostly did it. I'm gonna wrap it up. But I mostly did it because I'm the first generation. Somebody had to do it.
Right. Anyone else? Yeah.
So first of all, I loved it, even though parts of it went a little bit over my head. You talked about Gutman's deliberative democracy, though. And I started thinking about that because you were talking about Charles Murray, who is, he is an academic.
By all accounts, a horrible human being as well.
I agree. But, as I think we've mentioned in some of our private discussions, he's retracted some of it.
Right.
And he's a little more advanced than, let's say, what the mainstream media comes out with. Their controversial speakers, like, for example, back at UC Berkeley with Milo Yiannopoulos,
right,
who is more or less not even an academic, just a controversial internet figure. So I would like to ask, is it possible that when you have controversial speakers kind of like that, or like a white nationalist, that's not really necessarily bringing a different point of view, but more or less just more negative populism into a community, or to a university, that the idea of deliberating with them is...
A few weeks ago, my absolutely brilliant professor, Brad Roth, gave a talk at the Humanities Center Symposium where he talked about civility on campuses. And he said that there are certain things that don't need to be said, such as what Richard Spencer is saying, for example, to borrow another controversial example from what you were saying. And those people do more damage than good. Or they do more damage than they do benefit public discourse, because the things they're saying are so pernicious, so invasive, that they just don't need to be said. So I would classify people like Richard Spencer in that category. But I want to say that those are a very small number, I feel. And especially with regards to Charles Murray, who, as I've said, I'm not defending what he says. I think he is certainly controversial, but aside from that, he is, a kind of, he plays to the interests of white nationalism in a very subtle way, or he did at least when he wrote The Bell Curve, right? But he wasn't even invited to talk about that at Middlebury, and even at U of M, it happened a few weeks ago, the same thing. He was invited to actually talk about how he dislikes Donald Trump, and about a new book he wrote called Coming Apart, which seeks to kind of diagnose the kind of white working class and the reasons why they would vote for a candidate like Donald Trump. So I wouldn't put Charles Murray in that category, but I would say that there are speakers and people who do more damage than they do benefit if they're invited to a campus. But I think that those would be a small number compared to, the norm now seems to be that conservatives as a whole, like Ann Coulter and Ben Shapiro and others, are the people that people don't think they should be allowed to speak on campuses. Yeah.
Thanks, Dominic. It was interesting to hear all of your talk come together. I've talked to you about pieces of it, but
I've been for the Wayne and Abruzzo program. If anyone wants to go to Italy, you should talk to Elena after the talk. She is.
So I was just wondering if you could tease out your definition of the political, because you talk about the emptying of the political from university campuses, but it seems to me that some of what we're seeing, although potentially distasteful and certainly inappropriate when it gets violent, is actually the diffusion of a political movement against these speakers.
Right.
So it's spreading via social media, and people are very well organized, and in fact using political techniques we haven't seen on campuses since the 1960s. So I see that instead potentially as a counter-argument to what you're saying about the emptying.
So the thing I would say is I think that in terms of defining the political, I think I would borrow from what Moof describes. I mean, the political is the essence of not only different opinions and different positions and the debating and discussing, but the very kind of conflictual nature, right? You can't. She writes a lot about the idea that society is constantly built on what she calls hegemony, right? Any one given social order at any one time is just the representation of those interests of those people who formed that social order and made it normal. But that inevitably involves kind of an exclusion of certain groups of people from what is considered normal. And that very fact necessitates that in societies claiming to be democracies or in society as a whole, there's always going to be the possibility for what she calls antagonism, which is this conflict. But she uses the term agonism because it is a better way of describing the kind of the discursive and the kind of the verbal nature of the political, right? It is the means by which we debate things that both affect us. We engage in discussions. We hear each other out, right? So that's how I would define the political, at least. I'm a firm believer in Gutmann's deliberative democracy and kind of the debate and discussion as the means by which democracy is facilitated, or politics, if you will. And also the political is also the idea that we can disagree, right? Universities don't want students to disagree, right? If you look at any time there's a protest or anything on campus, the university administration is like, nothing to see here, everything's fine, right? And so we don't want students to disagree, we don't want students to engage. At least that's how I see it. So that's also how I would define the political. But to your other comment, I think the sense of outrage that those students at Middlebury showed towards Murray is admirable. And I think we need that kind of outrage at people who do present controversial ideas. But what my problem is the idea that such controversial ideas should be met with attempts to silence them. That's what I think the problem is. I have no problem with protesting Charles Murray. I have no problem with silent protesting Charles Murray or controversial speakers while they're speaking. It's the idea that you can respond by standing in front of someone and shouting at them, or turning around and shouting at people who are there to legitimately may be interested in what he has to say. So I think there has to be a balance, right? I think protest Charles Murray outside, have a picket line, have signs, tell people, what you think he is wrong about. But then let him speak, but then engage him after. I mean, refute him, right? The university, or Middlebury College, wanted students to come and engage him. They wanted students to ask him questions and argue against him in the Q&A period. I think that's how you refute the kind of speech that Charles Murray has. I don't think you do it by shouting at him. I don't think you do it by kind of, sequestering him in one part of the stage and seeking to block him from everyone else who's in the auditorium. So I think the response to his speech has to be a refutation of what he's saying using the speech of people who disagree with him. Yeah. Isaac, this is the first time we're meeting in person. I'm so happy.
Nice to meet you. So I was interested that you drew a line between someone like Richard Spencer and then people like Ann Coulter,
Yeah.
or I believe you gave one other example.
Ben Shapiro. Who's also a horrible person.
Right, and considering them conservative rather than someone like Richard Spencer, who's beyond the pale. I think a lot of that might have to do with just like the moment that we're in, but like Ben Shapiro and Ann Coulter are avid white supremacists, right? Whether or not they are in the mainstream of the conservative movement, they are openly white supremacists. They say things like, the reason white people do better is because they are better. That is a white supremacist notion that is dangerous, right? So if we bring speakers like that to campus who are white supremacists, however mainstream they may be, what then is the value in allowing them an open platform more than allowing someone like Richard Spencer an open platform if their ultimate goals are the same? And related, what's the value in teaching or encouraging black and brown people to engage in civic discourse with white supremacists who do not respect their humanity or their opinions?
Well, so I guess if I can agree with your assertion. Maybe you are more aware of this time that Ann Coulter and Ben Shapiro would be considered, white supremacists. I am not entirely familiar with what Ann Coulter says. I just know her as a conservative. So if that's the case, then I would agree with you. But no, I don't think it's valuable to have a white supremacist come to campus. But what I am talking about is I think people who do hold, like for example, a few years ago, Condoleezza Rice spoke at Rutgers and she had to cancel her speech because there were people saying that she shouldn't be allowed to speak. I'm talking about mainstream conservatives who seem to be met with a disposition that you shouldn't, that there's no place for what you're saying here. And I don't know, like Milo and Ann, I think yes, but maybe Ben Shapiro. I don't know if you would you consider Ben Shapiro a white supremacist? Is that? I know he's a numbskull, but he's not.
And I mean, I think maybe the issue is that there's an idea that to be a white supremacist, you have to say like Nazis are good,
Right.
bad. And you don't,
right?
White supremacy, by definition, is just thinking that white people are better
Yes.
than non-white
Yes,
people.
yes.
And all of these people, mainstream conservatism is currently running in that direction, right? I mean, we see it, the President of the United States
Right.
is a white supremacist who is now the head of the mainstream conservative political party.
I wouldn't go so far as to say that all mainstream I think there are plenty of honest conservatives that are not white supremacists.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's fine.
No, are you?
It's fine. Go ahead.
But I wouldn't be so quick as to say that conservatives are white supremacists. I think there are plenty of.
Yeah, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that it's become the mainstream of the conservative.
It has, but I think there are enough conservatives who are not part of that, who are worth inviting and worth hearing out and worth speaking. I'm here speaking about someone maybe like Andrew Sullivan or David Brooks. However much you may disagree with what they say, I think they are examples of what I'm.
And I don't think they're being thrown off campus. Is the point.
No, they're not. They haven't been invited. They haven't. I haven't heard of any times at which they've been invited. All you hear about are the extremely controversial ones. Yeah, Molly.
So I want to just follow up on Isaac's second question because I'm really interested in your response to it. So correct me if I'm asking wrong. But so when we have these groups of students who have been historically silenced and have been historically targeted by people, even like Ben Shapiro,
Right.
who may or may not be white supremacists, what does it mean to tell those students you have to listen to these people? We have to like consider the ethics of care, right? When we're asking our students to listen to other people and how that impacts them. And so what does it mean to demand that students engage in conversation, demand that they listen before talking?
I would never ask a student or tell a student that they have to listen to anyone. I would suggest that they do, but I would not say you have to listen to X person, especially a minority student who, like you said, has been traditionally silenced. But I think if, for example, you invite someone who is controversial to campus and some students listen, some students don't, I think, it's rather than if you don't want to listen to that person, if you are so unnerved by what they're saying, and I can certainly understand that, I think the answer is to not do what happened at Middlebury, for example. It's hold a different event at the same time. Invite other students who may feel alienated by what these people are saying, and engage with discussion with them, engage in political action outside of the event venue. My main problem with what happened at Middlebury and what happened at U of M a few weeks ago, and even what happened at the University of Oregon, I think it was 2 weeks ago, where students stormed the stage of the university president trying to give the state of the university address, is that the response to these ideas must be to just stand there and yell, or to turn around with signs and try and stop someone from
What
speaking.
if that's your only means of fighting back? What if you literally cannot speak because you are so overwhelmed by the presence of this white supremacist that is taking up a space in your learning environment?
Right. Like I said, my answer to that would be then create a different space and bring people to that space.
Why are we putting the onus on people of color and marginalized groups? Why not put the onus on the university who is supposed to be engendering an environment conducive to learning?
Well, and like I said, I would not invite a white supremacist. Like I would not. So that's
How it is like what's okay and what's not okay? Where do we draw the line?
That is not something that, I certainly have my opinions about what I would consider, but that's ultimately a question of what university judgment is.
Yeah, but I think that when we're, in terms of your talk, when we're thinking about creating a student body that is politically involved, part of the work that you're doing is to theorize what's okay and what's not. So future.
Right. No. I would not especially force a student of color to listen to someone or I would not, for example, support what happened with Richard Spencer in Florida. I think it was last week, and then passing the burden of $500 million or $500,000 in securities, $500,000 of security charges to taxpayers and students was a joke, right? And I think inviting him was a joke, and it was wrong. And I would say the same for other white supremacists. But I think that if you invite someone who's a controversial speaker to campus, for example, and I would say that controversial speakers can be on both the left and the right. There may be people on the right, however much you don't like hearing it, there are people on the right who may be alienated by what someone on the far left says. That happens. But I think in doing that, you need to say we are inviting this person to campus, And if you don't like what they're saying, right, you can ask them questions, you can refute them in a Q&A, you can engage them. And if you are offended by what they're saying and you don't like what they're saying, you know, you can engage in action outside the venue, but we are then going to have something else where students who are not alienated by this person can come and air what their concerns are. And I would also think that if a university chooses to invite a controversial speaker to campus, they engage the input of the student body. Like, who do you want to come to campus? Who do you feel comfortable with coming to campus? Right? I know Richard Spencer just applied to speak at the University of Michigan after having been denied at Michigan State University. I hope U of M doesn't invite him, but if there are similar invitations like that in the future, I would hope that someone in the university administration would hold, say, a town hall and listen to what students have to say. If the majority of students don't feel comfortable with this person coming, you know, then that's a fine expectation. That's respectable. We won't invite them.
But then it's okay to yell and protest if he does come.
I would say it is. I would like we disagree on this. I know. I would move the yelling and the stuff outside of the venue is what I'm saying.
All right, I agree. Thank you.
Don't pull a professor's hair and twist her neck because she's trying to escort, you know, the speaker back to his car or something like that, right? Yeah.
Okay, so what's the role of rhetoric? You mentioned rhetoric might
Right.
be potential, helpful, in helping in this matter. So what would you do in the classroom to kind of speak to some of the things I think maybe Molly's, we're speaking to, and how does rhetoric fit into that?
So I think distinguishing things like rhetoric from citizenship or rhetoric from democracy, I think, it's impossible. I think rhetoric, as people like Dominic have said, is naturally implicated in matters of political ideology and democracy. It's always there. In the classroom, though, one of the things I loved about teaching English 1020 is that the whole first half of the class is rhetorical analysis. So we get to engage students to have arguments and to have discussions. So in the classroom, though, what I would try to do is, they present as long as it fits into what the classroom, what the course kind of schedule is, which again is probably a subject that fits under the guise of neoliberalism because everything is standardized and every teacher has to, do almost the same thing in all of these kind of basic classes. But I would, I had a political science professor, Kevin Degenkraus, who many of you, I don't know if you've taken a class with him, but if not, you definitely should, who taught democratic theory, and what he would do is he would, say, this is what we're going to talk about today, here are the different viewpoints about what we're going to talk about, maybe audio clips, maybe quotes, excerpts, what have you. What do you guys think about that, right? And then the classroom would become a sort of kind of like parliament, I don't know, right, where you stand up and you engage and you question people and you say how you feel about things. I think that's the most readily available pedagogical tool. But again, like I said, I don't think there's anything specifically prescriptive that you can take. But I think the role of rhetoric has to be the means by which students articulate their feelings about these ideas, the way students engage and question other students who may disagree with them, the way students simply state how they feel about any given topic and any position on that topic.
Do you have a source that you might have students read that might help with rhetoric or a reading?
Like a text or,
Yeah.
like, I mean, I love James Berlin and Kenneth Burke, but I don't know who else. It depends, right? I mean, last year when I taught English 1020, we were in the midst of the 2016 election, and so we read many excerpts from like newspaper editorials or newspaper articles or opinion pieces in magazines, especially in the rhetorical analysis section of 1020 for sure. Questions? Did you have? Yeah.
I thought this was an excellent presentation.
Grazie.
I think the more dangerous problem is the way that we're all sort of complicit in the neoliberal construction of the university, so that people think that this is job training, and even back in my generation, the whole reason that I decided to go to college was to be able to get a good job at the end of it. And probably that's the story for most of us in this room. So I think that the challenge is really how things can be restructured in such a way that is not at least the dominant way that we see a college education.
I agree with what you're saying. I would disagree slightly with the complicit part. I think there are plenty of faculty who think what is happening is wrong. And I think that in small ways, people like Elena and Richard, for example, in their classes, seek to push back against this and make classrooms a space where it's not about, meritocracy or job training. It's about learning and deepening your identity as a citizen. So I think there are probably some faculty complicit. My guess is most people in business and the hard sciences love what's going on.
Well, we all
But the
know that students
humanities-
are after a grade, they're after
Right,
their transcripts, they're after their grade point averages and stuff like
I-
that. And that's not stuff that you can just put
Right.
down and say that's irrelevant, because it's not
No,
irrelevant
true.
to students. And
Um,
so that's what we're all caught up in.
Right. And I don't, like I said, I don't think it would be, I think faculty who think it's wrong are trapped in this system. I think it's just the way things are, like you're saying. And a lot of times you have no choice but to go along with it, but if you can resist in small ways, you definitely should. And if your teaching can act as kind of a small model of that resistance, you should. But I think certainly faculty, and I know plenty of students feel as if, there's this economic kind of, shackle around their feet, the idea of, we have hundreds of millions of dollars in student loan debt. Students are graduating with no job prospects, yet they were promised, come here, do this major, we're gonna give you a job, you're gonna have a job when you graduate. And for some students that doesn't happen, right? Or the obsession with graduating with a 4.0, for example, rather than what you learned as opposed to the grade you get in the class. Yeah.
Can I follow up
Yeah.
what you were saying? Do you think there's a possibility that there could be a mix between what you're advocating and still the idea of having to get a good job? Like, for example, when I switched my major to political science, every member of my family looked at me and said, what the hell are you going to do with that?
Mhm.
And, I had to sit and think about it for a minute. I'm like, well, I don't know. I want to do political science because,
You love it.
I watch too much MSNBC. But do you think...
Please don't do that.
I'm kidding.
BBC, CBC,
I know.
NPR.
I was joking, it came to mind. Do you think there could be a mix between the two where people can focus on what they love?
Call me naive, but I think if you pursue what you love, things are going to work out for you. Right.
Okay.
My best friend here switched his career from engineering to journalism, and he loves his life now, was told he was not going to get a job, and now works at Channel 4. So I think if we encourage students to pursue what they have passion about, I think just usually as it works out, it does. But what I'm saying now is the encouragement is you need to do this because it's more profitable, the job prospects are better, right? Study this. My biggest regret in college was that I did not study music because I was told I wouldn't get a job. That was my first choice, but I chose not to because I was dissuaded from doing so. There you go. Any other comments? Yeah, Janet.
Yeah, just to follow up a little bit, because I think if you put the talents of the individual first as the way to go, then you get tomorrow's jobs. If you train for jobs you get yesterday, you're not going to get it. You're not going to get either one.
Right.
So I think it's a self-defeating proposition.
Anything else, or was that just a
No,
follow-up?
it's a follow-up.
Oh, okay.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
You talked about the triple up economics of how, the rich are getting richer and whatnot and so forth. But, trickle down economics doesn't work.
Well,
But trickle up economics does.
trickle down is another way of trickle up, right? You trickle down by funneling wealth upward, and the
But does it
idea is
seem
that
like it
eventually it'll
works?
get down. No, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But triple up always works.
Well, it makes the rich richer and the poor poorer.
Do you think that there's going to be a cap where, it's already, I think it's like 10% of the wealthiest people own more than 90% of the poorest people? Do you think there's going to be a way where, the richest people are going to be supporting us because we are making penny?
If Republicans keep winning elections, no. Any other comments?
Thank you, Gavin.
I appreciate everyone coming.